Well, here we go. Week 9. Can you believe week 9? And we're going to cover Numbers 31 all the way into a new book of Deuteronomy in chapter 11. And this is a pivotal transition as Israel prepares now to enter into the promised land. But before we even dive into the highlights I want to cover, it's important to know how these two books function differently. So Numbers is an historical narrative. It moves forward chronologically through Israel's journey in the wilderness times. Now Deuteronomy picks up, and it's more of reflective speech. Call it Moses' farewell words, final words, reminding Israel of their past and reaffirming their covenant with God. And together they set the stage for what comes next in Joshua. But let's stay here for now. Let's dive into 3 key highlights that I want us to keep as we go along in the readings this week. So the first highlight is this: preparation for entering the promised land. In the final chapters of Numbers, Israel is getting ready to enter into Canaan. And you can imagine a lot is happening with this. They first, as we read about, engage in battle with the Midianites, and then they set up the tribal land disputes and they establish cities of refuge. And this overarching theme develops here: preparation, both physically and spiritually. The division of the land and the reinforcement of the justice systems that God is setting up show that God is structuring Israel's society to reflect his order before they even step into the land that he's promised them. Now, the second highlight is the introduction to the book of Deuteronomy. And as we transition from Numbers to Deuteronomy, we shift from this historical narrative to Moses' farewell speech. You can imagine Deuteronomy this way. It's structured as a series of sermons by Moses that remind Israel of their journey, the laws that God gave them, and the covenant that they have to uphold. It's a book of renewal, and it's a book of transition, both for leadership as Joshua prepares to take over after Moses passes away, for the people there in Israel, and as they move forward from this wilderness wandering to settling as a nation. Now, the last highlight I want to bring up is revisiting God's laws for this new generation that's coming up. A major focus in the early chapters of Deuteronomy is Moses reteaching God's laws to this new generation. You got to remember, many who originally received God's laws at Mount Sinai had died in the wilderness, and now their children are being reminded to uphold God's commands as they enter into the promised land and continue to live there. And this right here, we got to stop and reflect. It serves as a very powerful reminder for us today. We are called to pass down God's word and his ways to the next generation, our children, their children's children, to remain faithful to God and his commandments. Now, next, let's transition to 3 key themes to pay attention to. The first is this: God keeps his word. Throughout Numbers, we've seen Israel's ups and downs. They are many. But as the book closes out, one truth stands firm: God is faithful to his promises. Despite their disobedience, they're about to enter into this land that God swore to their ancestors. This reminds us that even when we falter, God's word remains true. Next, the theme of learning from past mistakes. As Moses recounts Israel's journey in Deuteronomy, he highlights past failures, and he warns this new generation coming up, do not repeat these things. The refusal to enter Canaan 40 years later, coupled with idolatry and rebellion, all serve as lessons to learn from. Moses is urging Israel to remember their history so they don't repeat this history. And we can take this today and apply it to our own walk with God very easily. Lastly, the last and third theme is the spiritual dangers of comfort and success. In Deuteronomy 8, we're going to read warnings that Israel cannot settle in this land without obeying God's commands continually. They won't prosper if they forget who gave him or who gave them the success. Comfort and abundance leads to spiritual apathy. And just like it did for them, it's a warning for us. When things are going well in life, let's not drift away from our dependence on God. And finally, I want to look at one supernatural worldview focus, and that's this: the promised land and its spiritual significance. Hear me on this. The promised land isn't just about real estate. It represents God's dominion. Think spiritually here. In Numbers 33, Israel is commanded to drive out the inhabitants that are there and destroy their idols, showing that this land is spiritually contested. Not just physically, but spiritually. This is not just about some military conquest, but about reclaiming sacred space for Yahweh. And the influence of rebellious spiritual beings that are tied to the nations are an important backdrop to keep in mind as we read here. Dr. Michael Heiser's concept of cosmic geography helps frame this a little bit more. In biblical thought, territories were often linked to spiritual powers. It's the same way today, we just don't think about it that much. Israel's conquest is more than a geopolitical event. It has a larger spiritual battle where God is reestablishing his kingdom on earth. So these warnings against idolatry and assimilation are not just cultural concerns. They reflect the ongoing battle between Yahweh's rule and the corrupt spiritual influences that are over the nations that Israel faces. This week's readings, they are truly packed with transition, preparation, faithful reminders about God's faithfulness to us. They're very powerful reminders. So as we move through Numbers into Deuteronomy, think about these lessons and apply them to your life by asking questions like this. Ask yourself, am I preparing myself for what God has ahead for me? Am I learning from my past mistakes? Am I staying spiritually grounded in both times of hardship and success? Now, if you've been following along, drop a comment below. What stood out to you in this video? Or as you read along, what stands out in the readings? And if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you don't miss breakdowns in the future. And I'll see you guys next week as we continue in this Bible reading journey together.